All right, this is another short story out of A Fine and Pleasant Misery. This story is called Grogan's War Surplus. My old camping buddy Wretch, his eyes dreamy and wet with nostalgia, leaned forward and stirred the fire under a sizzling pan of trout with a stick. I could tell he was getting deep into his cups because that's the only time he turned sloppily sentimental. Also, we were cooking on a propane camp stove. You know, he said, it seems like only yesterday you and me was crouched in the mud in some god-forsaken place using our bayonets to roast a couple hunks of spam over some canned heat. Yeah, and heating our water in steel helmet, I said, sinking suddenly into the morass of reminiscence, and lying awake night after night in a pup tent, listening for the first sound of attack. And half our gear riddled with bullet holes, Wretch put in, shaking a tear off the end of his mustache. Yep, I said, we really had some great camping when we were kids. Just two dang bad kids nowadays don't have some of those old-time war surplus stores around to sell them their camping gear. Wretch forked a small, crisp trout out of the pan and munched it down tail first. Say, what was it that I was always attacking? What was it that was always attacking us in those days? I'm not sure what they were called, I said, glancing out at the surrounding darkness. But they were always big and hairy and had red eyes and teeth the size of railroad spikes. I haven't seen one of them since I was 12 years old. I leaned over and stopped Wrench from throwing a log on the fire. Not when I was sober, anyway. Say, Wretch said suddenly, you remember old Grogan's War Surplus store? Did I remember Grogan's War Surplus store? Why, the mere sight of that melodious name was my heart dance. Delight fantastic. Grogan's War Surplus. Ah, how could I ever forget? Immediately after World War II, Grogan had remodeled an old livery stable and feed store in the style now referred to as in architectural textbooks as War Surplus Modern, a decor that attempts to emulate the aesthetic effects of a direct hit on an army ordnance depot. The store itself was elegantly festooned with Gary cans, yellow life rafts, landing nets, ammo boxes, and other assorted residue of recent history. On the lot behind the store, the plundered wreckage of a dozen or so military vehicles had been clearly arranged in such a manner as to conceal what had once been an unsightly patch of wildflowers. But all the really precious stuff was kept inside the store itself, illuminated by a few naked light bulbs and the watchful eyes of Henry P. Grogan. The great thing about Grogan's War Surplus was not only did it sell in every conceivable thing that might possibly be used for camping, but it was cheap. With a few dollars and a sharp eye for a bargain, you could go into Grogan's and outfit yourself with at least the bare essentials for a routine overnight camping trip. A sleeping bag, pup tent, canteen, cook kit, entrenching shovel, paratrooper jump boots, leggings, packboard, pack sack, web belt, ammo pouches, medic kit, machete, bayonet, steel helmet, fiber helmet, liner, 45 automatic holster, empty, GI can opener, and other basic necessities. Then, if you had any change left, you might pick up a few luxury items, things you had no idea what they might be used for, but were reasonably sure you would think of something. Ammo box, camouflage net, GI soap, parachute harness, and the like. Naturally, you never took all of this gear with you on a simple overnight trip. 9 times out of 10, you forgot the soap, and probably the can opener too. Since one of the rules of backpacking requires that all non-essentials be omitted from the pack, we strained our imaginations to bring every last piece of beloved war surplus into the realm of our necessities. Take the bayonet, for example. It was needed for cutting and spearing things. Frequently, it cut and speared things we didn't want it to cut. We didn't want cut and speared. But this drawback was more than made up for by its otherwise benign service as a cooking spit, paring knife, or even as a tent stake. The machete was needed any time you had to slash out your own trail. This necessity arose more often than a person who is not a kid with a machete might think. Sometimes you had to walk several miles out of your way in order for that particular necessity to arise. But time was no consequence when you were in search of necessity. Over the years, we slashed out literally hundreds of trails through the wilderness. The longest of these was the Great Rocky Mountain Divide Trail. It was never used much by backpackers, but the mother of a friend of mine who lived at the jumping off point later put up posts at each end of the trail and strung a clothesline between them. The other trails were built, of course, were not nearly so impressive as this one. We had learned from war movies that steel helmets could be used for boiling things in. On hot summer days, we found out what? Our heads. The helmets could also be used for pillows. If you went to sleep, your head would slip off the helmet and bonk on the ground. Bonking your boiled head on the ground kept you awake all night, which was one of the reasons for using a helmet for a pillow in the first place. Filling up a .45 caliber automatic holster was always a challenge, particularly since our parents had indicated they would just as soon as we didn't buy any .45 automatics, about the only thing you could do with the holster was stuff the sardine, cheese, pickle, onion sandwich into it to be a quick draw anytime you got hungry. Actually, a .45 automatic probably would have been safer than some of our sandwiches. You had to be a shrewd shopper not to get taken by Henry B. Grogan. We realized that some of the war surplus was brand spanking new. Other merchandise had obviously seen combat. It was cracked, tarnished, stained, ripped, riddled, rotten, rusty, and moldy. Frequently, Henry P. would try to pawn off some of the new stuff onto us, but we weren't to be fooled. We went out with the authentic war surplus. Can't you imagine how old Henry P. would roll his eyes and gnash his teeth every time one of us kids outwitted him like that? He'd get very angry. The real treasure, of course, was any item with a bullet hole in it. For a long time, you practically never came across anything with a bullet hole in it. And then one day, Larry Schwartz found a canteen with what looked like a honest-to-goodness bullet hole drilled right through it. Henry P. himself had to break up a fight to see who was going to get the perforated canteen. Immediately after that incident, all sorts of war surplus turned up with bullet holes in it. And we kept ourselves broke trying to buy it all. Then it occurred to us that maybe old Henry P. was going around at night with a hammer and a large spike, counterfeiting bullet holes. The bottom subsequently dropped out of the bullet hole market at Henry P.'s. Shrewd as I was, Henry P. managed to take even me a few times. One of the worst things he did was to sell me what he called one of the down bags used by Arctic troops to keep them comfortable in 70 below weather. The bags turned out to be a secret weapon of War Department, designed to be dropped behind the lines in hopes that enemy troops would attempt to sleep in them and either freeze or break out in an itch and would occupy both hands scratching for the duration of the war. The stuffing consisted not of down but chicken feathers with, if the size of lumps in the bag was any indication, several of the chickens still attached. But the worst feature of the bag was triggered by its getting even slightly wet. Anytime it rained on one of our camping trips, I went home smelling like high tide at the local chicken and turkey farm. Another time, Henry P. induced me to buy a 2-man mountain tent, so called, I later discovered, because it was heavy as a mountain and took 2 men to set it up. The roof and tent looked like it had been made out of dried bat skin and was impervious to anything but wind, rain, and heavy dew. A tubular air vent extended from each end of the tent, and an effect which combined with the bat skin roof gave it the appearance of a creature dropped in from outer space. It frequently gave us quite a start when we returned to camp late in the evening and glimpsed at the pterodactylus wings and the roof flapping in the breeze as the vent tubes were bobbing out. I remember one occasion when a brave kid named Kenny stood at a distance and threw rocks trying to drive our tent out of camp. The tent was designed to sleep 2 grown men, providing they were both pygmies on an exceptionally good terms with each other. We managed to crowd 4 of us into it. After drawing straws to see who got to have their heads by the air vents, the losers had to suck their air through bullet holes. If a loud sound suddenly reminded us of an unfinished business at home, there was always a big traffic jam at the exit. Sometimes we would be halfway home and still not out of the tent yet. As a result of these drawbacks for the mountain tent, I was constantly on the lookout for some kind of portable shelter that would afford me a bit more comfort and protection. One day, poking around Grogan's war surplus, I found it. After sorting through the ever-present snarl of nylon rope, I discovered a canvas tube attached to a dried bat skin and mosquito netting. The mosquito netting on one side had a zipper running the full length of it. "What is it?" asked Grogan. "That, my boy, is a single jungle hammock," he said. "This canvas is the hammock part. The mosquito netting is the walls, and this tough and very attractive fabric here is the roof." Not having any jungles readily available, I inquired as to how it would work in our part of the world. "Just fine," he said. "For example, there's some folks who don't much care for slimy, crawly old snakes sneaking in their nice, cozy 70 below down sleeping bags to get warm, and they like this here jungle hammock because it keeps them out of reach of the poisonous critters." I didn't let on the slightest to Grogan, and he just made reference to my kind of people. He nevertheless came to that conclusion because he scooped up the jungle hammock and carried it toward the checkout counter. "How is it for bears?" I asked in the tone of complete indifference, following along behind him. "Bears? Oh, it's fine on bears. In bear country, you just hitched it a little higher in the trees, say about 15 feet. The roof of the jungle hammock had some bad cracks in it. Several of the ropes were frayed, and mosquito netting had small tears in it, and the canvas looked as if it was being attacked by at least 4 varieties of exotic mold. Grogan didn't seem to notice, though, and let me have it for not much more than he would have charged for a new one. I lost no time in getting the jungle hammock home and suspended between 2 trees in our backyard for a trial run. It looked so secure, suspended up there in the air, a modest 10 feet from the ground, and I decided I would spend the night there. The family came out that evening to cheer me on as I climbed the step ladder to launch myself on the maiden voyage of the hammock. After they had retreated back into the house, muttering enviously, I zipped up the mosquito netting, wiggled into my chicken-down sleeping bag, and laid back to contemplate the closing in of my ancient enemy, darkness. After 4 or 5 hours of this contemplation, an unnerving thought occurred to me. I had not remembered to have the stepladder removed. It continued to connect ground and hammock like a boarding ramp for any ravenous beast that happened along. I leaped over to kick the ladder. As I did, the hammock flipped on its side, sending me like a shot through the mosquito netting and still encased in my sleeping bag. As bad luck would have it, my crotchety old dog, Strange, had a short while before staggered in from the night of carousing and collapsed on the target area. Nothing in his experience, of course, had taught him to expect me to be out at night, and let alone suspended in the air 10 feet above him. Consequently, a large screeching shape wrapped in chicken feathers plummeted down on him out of the darkness. It was certainly reasonable for him to assume that he had fallen prey to some huge carnivorous bird at night of the night. I, for my part, fully expected to be greeted by a hairy beast with fast snapping jaws, an expectation that did not go unfulfilled. Within 10 seconds, we had fought ourselves into the state of total exhaustion, perhaps not surprising when you consider the fact we had gone fully around the yard 3 times, failed on our attempts to climb several trees and a lilac bush, battered open the door to the house, and finally collapsed in a single panting heap on the kitchen floor. Both of us smelled of wet chicken feathers for days afterwards, and it was a full week before I could brush the taste of dog off my teeth. After I had recovered from the night, though, I couldn't help chuckling over how I put one over on old Grogan. If Henry P. had known the mosquito netting in the jungle on that jungle hammock was eaten plumb through with jungle rot, he would have charged me twice the price that he did. Do I remember Henry P. Grogan's war surplus supply store? I said to Wretch. Wasn't that high-class place with the sign and said, shirts and shoes must be worn in these premises? But he didn't hear me. He was too busy blowing on the fire. Good story. Like my hat? Это моя шапка из Кыргызстана. Я играю как buro. Это я люблю моя другая Kyrgyzstan. Хорошо. Please like, share, subscribe, and follow me more.